Thanks so much to everyone who's been able to join for today's webinar, which is part of JPEL's virtual event series, Charting the Next Decade of Evidence Generation in State and Local Government. As you know, this webinar is focused on how state and local governments are confronting the legacy and present day reality of inequitable policies, and how research and evidence can play a role in dismantling structural racism as a barrier to economic mobility. Our panelists today are Dr. Conrad Miller. He's an assistant professor of economic analysis and policy at UC Berkeley in the Haas School of Business. His research focuses on labor economics, policy, and discrimination, both in the US and internationally. Dr. Kantayani Murray is a public health expert and senior research associate at the Annie E. Casey Foundation. In her role at the foundation, she plans, commissions, and manages evaluations in the areas of youth and family well-being, evidence-based practice, and community safety. And finally, Shakima Townsend is the president and CEO of the Philadelphia Youth Network, which is a partner from the earliest days of the State and Local Innovation Initiative. In her time at PYN, she has overseen an expansion in innovative programming and also been a leader in broader systems change efforts related to labor and employment in the Philadelphia area. We'll spend about a half hour in discussion with these panelists before opening up for Q&A. But first, we'd like to start this conversation by getting a shared sense of the areas related to racial equity in which randomized evaluations have been used to generate evidence for policy development to date, as well as emerging opportunities for research. And Conrad will be presenting on those topics and also sharing insights from his own research. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to him.
Okay, thank you. And thanks to the organizers for including me in this program. So today I'm going to tell you about some research I've done on why some employers are more racially diverse than others. In contrast to most JPAL research, this work did not involve any randomized field experiments, but I will use this non-experimental work to motivate potential randomized experiments that could substantially improve our understanding of what steps firms and organizations can take to become more racially diverse. So I'll begin with some motivation for why we should be interested in this topic, how firms can diversify. First, the amount of interest in and money invested in diversity and inclusion efforts by organizations is increasing substantially. So one estimate is that over the last 5 years, the number of executives with diversity and inclusion titles has more than doubled. At the same time, there's still a lot of uncertainty as to what organizations are getting out of their diversity and inclusion initiatives. In fact, for the most researched type of initiative, diversity training, there's actually some suggestive evidence that these trainings can potentially backfire. So broadly speaking, there's a lot to learn about what types of initiatives actually work. Now, my goal in this presentation is not to convince you that diversity and racial equity more broadly matter. I suspect if you're watching this, you already have some understanding of why these issues matter. But for now, I do want to briefly mention that I think having a racially and culturally diverse workforce is particularly important for government agencies, which are often providing services to diverse communities. So this extends to the design and implementation of randomized control trials where a cultural competence can be particularly valuable. This is a point I think we'll be discussing in more detail in the panel. So now, while we don't have much evidence on what specific diversity initiatives are effective, my central claim today is that we do know something about the sources of systematic differences in diversity across organizations. And this knowledge can help us determine what types of diversity initiatives are likely to be successful. So I'll also argue that among initiatives that look like good candidates, we can use randomized experiments to identify the most effective ones. In my past research, I have identified and studied two important determinants of firm racial composition. The first is that larger firms tend to be more racially diverse. The second is that firms that are temporarily subject to affirmative action regulation increase the non-white share of their employees even after they are no longer subject to affirmative action regulation. And I'll explain this point in more detail in a couple of slides. Now, tying these together, I find evidence that both patterns are driven by a similar mechanism. In particular, these firms tend to recruit and screen more intensively than other firms and adopt personnel practices that make them less dependent on referral hiring. So here's the first fact, and that's that larger firms tend to have more Black employees in particular, but are more racially diverse more generally. The data presented here are from the 2018 quarterly workforce indicators a data set maintained by the Census Bureau. This figure reports the non-Hispanic Black share of the US workforce by firm size. So as you can see, the Black share of employees increases sharply with firm size. So while firms with fewer than 20 employees are on average 6.5% Black, firms with at least 500 employees are more than 15.3 are more than 15% Black. Now, this pattern actually holds even if we control for many factors like firm location, industry, the occupation or education level associated with the job. This pattern is really about firm size in particular. And as I'll speak to in a bit, this pattern is also present in Brazil, where I've also done some research, and that the context, and in Brazil, where there are racial disparities in the labor market that are somewhat similar to actually what we see in the US. Again, we see that larger firms tend to have more non-white employees. And I think this is an interesting fact for this question we're interested in here, because maybe we can learn something from large firms as to what they're doing that leads them to being more diverse. The second finding is that temporary affirmative action regulation has persistent effects on firm hiring behavior. So in particular, the affirmative action regulation I study here applies to US firms holding significant federal government contracts. So these are government contractors. Now, federal affirmative action regulation applies to contractors and mandates that they make good faith efforts to employ a diverse workforce. And shown in this in this figure, I find that affirmative action regulation actually sharply increases in establishments' Black share of employees, with the gains accumulating over time. There's a similar pattern for the Hispanic share of employees as well. So more specifically, what I'm documenting in this figure is how the Black share of employees changes at firms following the time that they first win a government contract and hence become subject to affirmative action regulation. So on the horizontal axis, we've got the year since a firm first wins a federal contract, where year 0 here refers to the year that contract starts, and so the regulation sort of first begins for them. On the vertical axis, we've got the Black share employee gains at these firms relative to the year before the firm first becomes regulated, which is indicated here by the vertical red dashed line. So as you can see, the affirmative action regulation here actually leads firms to steadily increase the Black share of their employees, with a gain of about 1 percentage point after 5 years. This is off of a base of about 13 percentage points, so it's a pretty significant increase over time. Now, I think even more interestingly, this pattern persists even after firms stop contracting with the federal government and hence are no longer subject to these affirmative action regulation and no longer directly incentivized to diversify. So for example, here, look at firms that are contractors for 2 to 3 years and then stop. So in this figure, the solid line indicates the period where the firm is regulated, where they're contractors, and the dashed line indicates their post-regulation period. So this is after they're no longer contracting with the government. You can see these firms increase the Black share of their employees while they're subject to affirmative action regulation. But strikingly, they continue to increase this share even after they're no longer regulated. And you can see this for other sets of firms. So for firms that are contractors for 4 to 6 years and firms that are contractors for 7 to 9 years, again, you see this persistent increase in the Black share of their employees, even following essentially their deregulation. Hence, a temporary regulation here is actually having a persistent impact on employer hiring patterns, even when firms have no direct incentive to diversify. They continue to do so. So what's going on here? I argue in my research that recruiting and screening practices are playing a central role. So the way I think about it is this: the hiring approach that all firms are endowed with is referral hiring. So hiring from your employees or your own social networks. Now, hiring through social networks is relatively straightforward and cheap. And this is what new and small firms tend to rely on. It's also quite effective in the sense that it's a productive approach to screening good applicants and making good hires. This is something people have found in other work. On the other hand, we know these social networks tend to be quite racially segregated. And so without further action on the part of an employer, referral hiring is going to tend to impede any diversity efforts. Now, as it turns out, larger firms and these affirmative action firms are typically less dependent on referral hiring. So instead, they tend to have more formalized human resource practices, recruit and screen more intensively, and they use additional screening recruiting methods like using employment intermediaries and job testing. Now, their motives are actually a little different, although they end up in similar places. So larger firms are more likely to invest in these practices and tools because they involve large fixed costs, and large firms can spread these costs over more hires. Their hiring volume also gives large firms more opportunities to experiment with and learn which hiring strategies are most effective for them. Now, on the other hand, affirmative action regulation incentivizes firms directly to hire from groups they weren't hiring from previously. So in response to that incentive, these firms adopt similar practices in order to accomplish this. So and finally, because these methods are actually effective in screening workers, you can see that from the fact that these larger employers are also applying them. Temporary affirmative action firms actually keep using these approaches even after they're no longer directly incentivized to diversify, essentially because they've paid the costs already to set up these methods, and they're effective, so they may as well continue to do them. So in summary, even though these firms actually don't have direct incentives to employ diverse workforces, they engage in personnel practices that, as a side effect, make them better at screening non-white applicants in particular, which tend to be non-referral applicants. So I want to show you a little bit of evidence on this front from some work I'm doing currently. And these are some results from a project I'm working on where we're using Brazilian data. And so one way to gauge how good a firm is at screening applicants from a particular job is to look at how often they make hiring mistakes. One measure of a hiring mistake is to look at how often a firm dismisses an applicant they've hired just a few months into the job. So this figure here is plotting racial disparities in Brazil in dismissal rates for firms of different sizes in Brazil. So the smallest firms, non-white hires are about 6% more likely than white hires to be dismissed for the same job just a few months after being hired. Yet we see here for the largest firms, this disparity disappears entirely. And what this suggests is that the largest employers here are equally able to screen white and non-white applicants for quality and fit. And we're arguing here that's because of these additional recruiting and screening practices that they employ. Okay, so what do we take from these findings? How does an organization interested in diversity act on them? I have a few suggestions here. So one approach is, in general, to try and act like these large and temporary affirmative action employers. By that, I mean develop and improve screening and recruiting practices to become less dependent on referral hiring. Now, in order to do this and to experiment and learn what approaches actually work best for a given organization, I think organizations must collect and maintain data on their hiring practices, actually tracking job openings all the way to hiring outcomes. So this allows organizations to answer questions like, do applicant characteristics used in screening actually predict performance? What methods correlate with racially diverse and successful hires? And in addition, organizations can learn from successful and diverse peer organizations and identify the recruiting and screening methods that those successful peers use. So you can kind of do a smaller or a more specified version of the analysis I'm showing you here today. Next, if feasible, organizations should experiment. And that's because even with data on what organizational practices correlate with success, it can be hard to tell what's driving what, and hence what effect a change in personnel practices will actually have. Okay, so for example, it appears true in the data that diverse organizations tend to have more diversity task force. But it's unclear, is that because diversity task force are actually effective in increasing diversity? Or maybe it's just that more diverse organizations are more interested in diversity to begin with, and so are more likely to form those task force. And it's going to be hard to tease those apart without some kind of something approaching a randomized experiment. Another question like this is that, in what I've shown you, large and temporary affirmative action firms, they do a whole host of things differently personnel-wise. So how do we actually know which component of those differences actually matters for increasing diversity? So randomized experiments play an essential role in generating evidence on these matters. And so I want to leave you here with a few examples of experiments that organizations have run to answer these questions, a couple of which have been implemented in practice, and a couple more that I hope are implemented in the future, something like them. So one, in a few studies, companies have tried randomly varying the information provided in job advertisements and found that actually some messages actually generate a much more racially diverse set of applicants. So in turn can lead to a more diverse set of hires. In another study, an organization found that providing incentives for employees to refer candidates from underrepresented groups can be effective. Organizations can also try to randomize the criteria they use in evaluating candidates to check if the status quo criteria they're using is actually yielding the best hires. Finally, companies can experiment with using various employment intermediaries to see which intermediaries actually generate the best candidates for them. So I'll stop there and look forward to discussing these topics and more in the panel.
All right, thanks so much, Conrad. So we're about to start the panelist discussion, and if you have any questions during that time, you can just submit them in the chat at the bottom of the screen. And I'd like to start by directing the first question to Shakima Kantiani. So based on your own experience with evaluation and research, was there anything that stood out in particular among the opportunities that Conrad shared to conduct your research? And is there anything that you'd want to add to that list from areas outside of labor and hiring?
Well, for me, it's not that I want to add to the list. I think that something that I'm still circling around that he shared is really the value of social networks as a structural asset or barrier in employment, especially when employing youth and young adults of color, particularly. And so, as I think through the different pathways, new hires might find their next career move, it just occurred to me how valuable, because so many employers still do rely on referral hiring, how valuable that is for a job seeker. I hadn't thought about it from the role of the employer as much, but hearing the presentation today really has me still circling around that concept. And it just gave me a new, I think, value proposition for why, building a diverse social network is really important for young people.
I first want to point out that I really appreciate Conrad's focus, kind of the frame of his research, really looking at a systemic driver of inequity, which in this case is related to the screening processes. And as Shakima mentioned, kind of this powerful role of personal networks. And just contrasting that with the frame that we generally hear around affirmative action and similar policies that really look at the individual, in this case, Blacks as being the problem and having the deficit. And in this case, with Conrad really centering the race equity by looking at the systemic driver and really honing in on the role of the firm in how it deploys its resources in bringing about this increase in Black employment. So first, I really appreciate that. And I also see that there's this important role to the benefit to the company of having a diverse workforce in terms of having different perspective and having different approaches to work that actually contribute to that firm's prosperity and growth and the growth of our economy, and wondering how we can have more research like this that also helps us to understand that the role of innovation or increase in innovation, increase in productivity that drives continuing having these kinds of screening and hiring policies in place that are intended to maintain a diverse workforce. So we kind of can get further to the benefits of diversity as opposed to this only being about a social justice argument, which is really important around redressing past wrongs.
Thank you. And building on that, this next question is for Shakima. In addition to managing programs that have served thousands of youth in Philadelphia, I know that PYN is continuing to innovate by developing new pilot programs through an incubator. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you identify those pilots, how they're being evaluated, and maybe how you work towards recruiting partners, building on the sense that there is a benefit and not just a moral imperative to diversifying the workforce.
Certainly. So in our work we describe our work as being an intermediary, but playing three important roles. And one of those roles is to build a system so that the connections between workforce preparation and secure attachment to a career pathway are not incidental, but intentional. And for us, that means many entry points, a diverse set of experiences to match with the young person's both need and developmental maturity, but also to look at how could that system be strengthened. And that's where our innovation work really sits. And we use a couple of important, I think, litmus tests, if you will, for whether or not this is the right approach for us and should we be trying those things out. We work with about 80 other nonprofit organizations. So our job is system design, our job is research and evaluation and reporting and leveraging the funding, and then we leave the work of service delivery to our network of partners. And particularly, we were looking to remove barriers to employment and also to address inequitable outcomes for specific populations. So we always look at our data and say, who's being left out of this? Are the outcomes different for pregnant and parenting young people? Are the outcomes different for young people who are connected to the juvenile justice system? And if we see disparity, what's driving that disparity and what can we do to try and address that? And so one of our efforts is related to a project called Generation Works that's actually funded by the Casey Foundation. And it's a partnership that we have to look at both hiring practices and job preparation and to build a bridge between those two entities, if you will, to really assess what are the job needs. Are you accurately reflecting those job needs? What are the job specific skills that you're willing to teach or will teach as a part of your onboarding process? And therefore you don't need to be advertising that as a prerequisite skill because it's leaving certain groups out. And then how are our training programs meeting your needs? And do you know about that, right? Like you as an employer, do you know about that? And that's a partnership with Youth Build and District 1199C and the United Way. And we came up with the partnership because we were looking at disparities by sector and saying, well, what can we do differently? Who's in the position to alter their training practices? Whose relationships are strong with their employers in the sector, right? The healthcare sector, the retail sector, that's willing to have these different conversations, non-traditional conversations. And where are we willing to both bend a little bit to address the unequitable outcome? So we look at this, the question of where is disparity Where's the data showing difference? And then we ask ourselves, what do we know about that, right? Who do we need to talk to? What do we need to learn? And then we say, how can we do something different, right? Like, what is the difference maker that we will pursue? When we think about preparation experiences for young people in connected into the juvenile justice system, we noticed that there was a huge disproportionality in even accessing the services. They weren't even applying. So we said, okay, what's happening here? Are we not in the spaces where they are? Do we need to build different partnerships with our probation and family courts? Should we be co-located? How do we raise awareness? And we've seen over the past, I would say 5 years that we've been working on this, not only a huge increase in the number of young people accessing the service, but also the participation rates have also gone up after 3 stubborn years of trying to figure out what does the partnership look like. So in every case, for us, when we are trying to pursue innovation, it's not just to say we're doing something new, it's to say, what's the barrier that's creating the inequity? And what's the new thing that we're going to try to address it? And when we try things that don't work, and that happens often as well, how do we stop and learn from that and then go back to the drawing board to reiterate?
Awesome, thank you. And Conrad, one of the other areas outside of hiring that I think affirmative action is often discussed is potentially in the area of education. And I'm wondering if you think there are broader policy implications for your findings outside of hiring and employment.
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think there are some connections. There are also some key differences. I mean, I think one connection here is this research suggests, in practice, there's a really important role. So people's social networks play an incredibly important role in the labor market. And I think actually one, benefit of having of affirmative action in higher education, of having racially diverse institutions, is that we would hope it actually facilitates relatively integrated social networks above and beyond getting the educational credentials. I think there's also an important benefit to people to get exposure to people from other groups that are going to be able to potentially lead to other important outcomes in labor market and more broadly. So I see one connection there.
Awesome, thank you. And I think taking a sort of a step back, or in the spirit of taking a step back and sort of expanding our focus, Kentayani, you lead many of the research-related racial equity investments at the Annie E. Casey Foundation. I'm wondering if you can share a little about how the foundation came to center racial equity in its work, and what's driving its strategic research priorities in this area.
Sure. Just to begin with the mission of the Annie E. Casey Foundation, it's to focus on developing solutions to build a bright future for children, youth, and families. And central to achieving that North Star is understanding how racist policies of the past have disconnected children of color from building blocks of opportunity. And many of these systems and structures still exist and persist today. And certainly 2020 has given us a wide view of the pernicious nature of structural racism and the urgency of now. Certainly, the foundation is for nearly a decade been focused on developing across all of the units, from our programmatic units to business and technology and facilities, ways for us to operationalize racial equity and inclusion in our work. And the focus is really to move beyond identifying disparities, as Shakima described, really trying to dig deep and understand what are those systemic drivers, what's the role of structural racism and institutional racism, and doing this in partnership with our partners and with community. So that's where the inclusion piece comes in, that it's really important for all of us to be focused in bringing our perspectives and understanding to the work. While our research priorities have been driven by this foundation-wide call to evidence to action, the research evaluation data team where I work has great flexibility in determining how we operationalize racial equity and inclusion in our work. We have been greatly influenced by the equitable evaluation framework, which was developed by the Equitable Evaluation Initiative under the leadership of Geraldine Coffey, who is a wonderful practitioner, scholar in this space, really pushing funders in particular, but it's certainly a framework that anyone can take up, really pushing us to move past traditional evaluation orthodoxy, traditional ways of doing evaluation that really allow for more power sharing with community and other ways to center equity in the work. And they have the three foremost principles that have driven our work. The first is just understanding that evaluation and research should be done in service to equity. And this is an axiological proposition. It's not about a particular method or approach. It doesn't say, you must do community-based participatory research, but just that we have the value that that this work is to be done in service to equity. And second, we're guided by the principle that the evaluative work should answer critical questions about culture, about context, about history, about these systemic drivers that we've been talking about. For example, having research questions to understand historical and structural decisions that have contributed to the condition being addressed. And another and third principle is that the work should be done commensurate with values that underlie equity work. So our team has really leaned into this and taken time to identify our common shared values around equity and a vision for how we show up in our work. For example, we're increasingly planning and supporting evaluation and policy research projects where we're engaging community members in ways where we're increasingly sharing power, allowing them to be part of the decision-making process. And in some cases, it may not be a geographic community. It may be, if they're juvenile justice youth, how do we engage those youth and their families in ways to guide the evaluative work. And that really speaks to our values around human dignity, equity, inclusivity, and a willingness to question our own assumptions and kind of come at it like we're the only experts in the work.
Awesome. Thank you. That's really helpful, I think, larger framework. And to your point that there's a need for research that goes beyond just identifying disparities, I'd actually like to open this up to all of the panelists, but how can policymakers and researchers be more intentional about identifying research opportunities and designing evaluations that can inform policies to foster racial equity?
I'll jump in here. I do think that Kantini really brought up something that is critical, which is understanding the context, history, and decision making that's led to this point, and recognizing that in some cases, actually in many cases, those decisions were intentionally designed to exclude. And I think that the thing that I'd like to see more of is the naming of that, right? And the acknowledgement of not just the choice, but the consequences associated with those choices, and then using that as a guide for course correction. I think oftentimes one of the challenges that we see, especially myself as a practitioner who works in conjunction with researchers, is the design is there, the thought process of how it's going to work is there, and then there's the reality. And how you rebound from the reality may be, you may have a lot of of flexibility depending on what you're trying to accomplish with the research that you're doing, or you may have very little flexibility. And when things don't pan out the way you thought that they were going to pan out, the consequences of not shifting or changing or not including the right people in the design process really is detrimental. And sometimes, honestly, especially as a nonprofit, I've seen so much money wasted because we will get a report, but the report is not helpful to move the needle or the impact. So I do think that one of the most critical things is spending more time really assessing the context and the decisions, and having some level of transparency about those choices, and what led to those decision points. And then also, I do think that we often talk about power sharing, but it's really important that the comprehension around data, and sometimes these conversations can be extremely exclusionary just by the language that we use, the questions that we ask, sometimes the titles that we hold, right? There's a space and place for all of those things. And sometimes in creating an inclusive environment, that's not the space for it, right? And I think that spending some intentional time, not just disaggregating data, but spending more time on context and meaning and language and calibration. I think that's really, really important, so that what you're sometimes, even in my own organization, and we all working on the same thing, if we use the same words and mean different things, and if we don't spend active time checking for meaning, we don't necessarily achieve the result as fast or as adequately as we could have. And so I think those are areas that we don't spend enough time on in the design stages. And that's something that I'd like to see expand.
Awesome. Kintayani and Conrad, do you have any other thoughts you'd like to share as well?
I can jump in. I really feel that the role of community engagement in research and evaluation is something that we really need to take seriously, and really figure out how we can better elevate voices. And I really appreciate Shakima's comment around how we show up in these inclusive spaces can occur in a way that we really are not being inclusive because of the language that's being used or how power is wielded in the room. And so I think there's a really important role for capacity building and empowerment. And it has to be bidirectional in a way. Again, going back to this point of we're not all the experts in the room. It's also thinking about community as bringing knowledge, as bringing expertise, and there's a way that we all have to, as researchers and policymakers and practitioners, we show up so that we can allow their authentic voice and their meaningful participation to really take hold. I think that community engagement is important, similar to the point earlier around having diverse evaluation teams, that we're actually talking about raising the excellence in the research, about producing the best data. And we often miss out because we think, oh, because these folks are respondents in the evaluation, that's how we're getting their voice. But if we don't have them, for example, involved in conversations around, well, what should our research questions be? And how do we define this success? Then we really are going to miss out on opportunities to have the strongest data and the most actionable data to move policy forward. And I think that it's incumbent upon funders to make sure that projects are resourced in ways to actually provide that time, that space to have that relationship building and those other kind of relational pieces that are needed to build trust and what have you, so that we can help people to feel comfortable and feel like they belong in spaces and that they can make a contribution. We also want to be able to have the resources so that there is that capacity building and the opportunity for knowledge sharing across the quote unquote experts in the room and the community members, so that we're all learning from one another. I just don't want us to have the thought that we just, say there should be community engagement and it just happens. It has to be resourced and it has to be something that is intentional from the very beginning of the project in order to have that impact that we would like in terms of the process, and then in terms of the final product to have strong data that is actually going to be able to move policy forward in a way that helps us to come close to achieving equity.
I don't have much to add here. I think Shakima and Kantani have really hit the key points on community engagement and really understanding context before doing anything. I think one point I want to emphasize is that even before getting to that point, I think just collecting data is often taken for granted as a key step. So I think organizations, governments need to have a willingness to look for problems, to collect the data necessary to identify them. And I don't think all organizations are necessarily willing to do that, because sometimes the outcomes that you identify are not pretty. The results, the disparities don't look good. So I've definitely had experiences where organizations weren't interested in collecting that data in the first place because they were perhaps afraid of what might come out of it. So one example of this I'm reminded of recently is there's a study by a couple of now former Berkeley PhD students who identified racial disparities in property tax assessments, even within the same city for a given value of home. You actually they identified racial disparities in the actual property taxes people had to pay. That was really interesting, and I think at least to that point had not been identified in such a general way. But I don't think it's something that I think any local government could have identified this problem earlier on and made a point to address it, but it's just something that people hadn't thought about, as far as I can tell. So just a willingness to actually identify those problems and in a directed way, look for the data you need to measure them, I think is also a key starting point. And actually getting community engagement to actually identify those problems in the first place is also a useful way in which these kind of two aspects tie into one another. So for example, in this property tax paper, it turns out, people had actually had anecdotal evidence that this kind of thing was happening. But no one had the power or the data to really identify it in a general way. And so it's possible with community engagement in the first place, some local governments would have seen this problem much earlier on.
Yeah, so since community engagement has come up as sort of a crucial element of effective evaluations that contribute to racial equity, I'm wondering if any of you can share some examples of when you felt that you or your organization were able to do that in a really great way, and how it sort of shifted the design of an evaluation, or how you were able to identify an opportunity, and maybe also an example of when things didn't go quite the way you would have wanted, and how that sort of maybe negatively impacted the evaluation. Just to add a little more detail, and I think an indication of what this looks like when we really get on the ground.
Oh, I have two easy ones because I have lots of epic fail moments and I have no problem sharing them. So I'll start with the epic fail moment. For us, one of the things that we were trying to do, this was 9 years ago, was diversify the types of services we were offering, and particularly to have career or work-based learning experiences happen for younger youth, because we had a system that was built on traditional summer jobs and you started at 14, but all of the research and all of the data was suggesting that we needed to be having these services happen earlier in middle school. And so we designed a program that mimicked our traditional summer jobs program that had been evaluated and had some promising results. And we basically implemented, I would say, traditional summer jobs light for 12-year-olds, right? They were rising eighth graders. What we should have done was have a lot more engagement with that age group because we had no history as an organization working with that. And we should have spent a lot more time talking to parents and talking to young people and probably engaging with middle school teachers as well. We had a lot of developmental research. And so we did the first year and those kids ate us alive. Lovely children, but they were like, listen, this sucked. We didn't like it. And a lot of it was we had this very narrow focus about exposing them to STEM-based careers. It was singular in its thoughts. It was very structured and all of the activities made a lot of sense. It didn't make sense for that population. And the one thing that when we looked back and we said, well, there were many things we would have done differently. The biggest asset was that we asked them after the fact. The biggest mistake was that we didn't ask them from the beginning, right? And so that's just like an example of this community engagement or having, your stakeholders have so much more power. We were looking at it as we are doing this work. We are the experts. I think Katani said that before, right? Like we're the experts in the room. But the truth of the matter is 12-year-olds were the experts about what they were going to participate and enjoy. And we were less informed about that. And it came down to some very basic things that we would have never thought about because you don't think about work in this way. And so they really wanted to know, wanted to have a work camp experience, right? They wanted part fun, part engagement with their peers, and they wanted food. And it was some very basic things about that. And that lesson really taught us, that it was a power dynamic. It was this concept in our minds that we knew how to do this because we've been doing, summer employment programs for X amount of years, when the truth of the matter is we didn't know how to do it. Fast forward, that was the first 300 kids. I'm sorry, we didn't do a great, we implemented the program, it just wasn't to their satisfaction. But now we're at the stage where we have like 1,000 kids going through this particular model, and it's varied in design, it's varied in scope, it provides all of those things. And a lot of that change was made because we just took the time to engage the stakeholder, the result that we were trying to do. And so I think that to me was like one of our good epic fail moments. Where we succeeded in this, I will say, when Project U-Turn released Unfulfilled Promises, which was the first look at Philadelphia's high school dropout crisis in about 2005-ish, right? And they were looking at data prior to 2005. And where we got that right was starting with young people and understanding that we knew very little about what was causing young people to leave their secondary educational experience without the credential. And young people, and what we learned was not only were the stories and the experiences vary greatly, that each instance was just as varied as the young people themselves. And that led us down a very different path of understanding the information. And I think that's one of the examples where we got it right? We started with the most critical group of stakeholders, which was young people who had left their traditional high school experience and tracing back their past to some archetypes. And so we got a way of organizing information and data because we had a lot of data and information, but we didn't understand it. The context didn't mean anything. And we realized that the strategies needed to also be differentiated in order to build a system of multiple pathways to high school graduation. And I think that example, Unfulfilled Promises, A Promise Worth Keeping, it led to an approach to iterating off of the same question about what have we learned now and what more do we need to learn, as well as addressing some of the systemic barriers like school discipline policies, policies that were removing kids based on their connection to the juvenile justice system, policies that had young people who maybe were in the foster care system now being shuffled from one school to another. Now that foster care system maintains that young people try to stay within 10 miles of their home school, policies around data sharing amongst schools so that educational continuity could be possible. All of that became changes in policy because we started out with the constituents and understood the problem from the lens of those who were greatest affected. And I think that that's one of the examples where I'm proud as an organization to be a member of Project U-Turn. When I look at the systemic impact and the increase in high school graduation rate that work has had, a lot of it had to do with a shift in paradigm and creating a community of learners, no matter who was engaging with the young person. So we had a cross system, a cross sector youth serving agencies who were all learning together with the data. And we made some choices not to use the data as punishment for any system or blame for any systems failing. And I think those sort of early value propositions within that work really led to the sustainability that we see today.
I have an example, one example that has some successes and some fails. So I'll try to wrap that all in as quickly as I can. So I was the program manager for a project that just ended that was an evaluation of a community safety pilot in a community in Atlanta. And as part of that project, there were stakeholders, lots of grassroots stakeholders who actually developed the community safety pilot interventions. And there was a research advisory committee that came out of that stakeholder work for the evaluation. So there was a resident advisory committee, evaluation resident advisory committee, that's what they were called. And that group was partnered with Morehouse School of Medicine, a team at Morehouse School of Medicine that was tasked with leading the evaluation, but also providing capacity building with the RAC so that they could understand every phase of the evaluation process and participate. So they were actually part of the research question generation process. They were part of the data collection process. So not just reviewing the data collection tools, but when there was time for focus groups, some of them actually participated as focus group co-facilitators. And then at the end of the project, when we concluded, we created a one-pager infographic as a way to make the findings accessible to the community. And the RAC participated in developing that one-pager. And they're now part of the dissemination. So when they are going to go to the community association meetings, they have some support getting the one pager out to the community, but then they've had a walkthrough and they understand how to present it. So they have complete ownership over that dissemination process. And they also have access to the full final report as well. So it's part of the work. The transparency principle has been consistent throughout, and they even throughout the process saw preliminary data as it was coming in and had discussions with the organization that led the intervention, so that they were part of the conversations around improvements along the way. So what was another positive was that the foundation was able to be flexible with the timeline. So when COVID came, it just totally messed up the timeline but we were able to extend the project to give time mainly for the RAC to be involved in the data analysis and creating that one pager, as opposed to just kind of trying to wrap it up quickly. On the negative side, I think that the foundation really could have done a better job of communicating our role in the collaboration upfront. So we were pretty hands off in the beginning, but as it got closer to when there was a final product and we saw, the stakes were high, we wanted to see positive results and make sure that things were presented in a way that comported with kind of our culture. That's when we were a little more involved. And the RAC didn't realized that change, and I think the Morehouse School of Medicine team was also taken aback a little bit. So I think in retrospect, at the very beginning of the project, the foundation could have been more upfront and communicative about how they wanted to collaborate and offer space for some back and forth, because maybe we didn't need to be as hands-on as we wanted to be at that point. So I think that just kind of brings up some of the power dynamics and the need to really at the very beginning for the evaluation team and the funder to be really thoughtful and reflective about making sure that their values or stated values for why they want to have community engagement align with what they want to do and how they want to collaborate at every phase of the work.
Awesome. Thank you for those. So sort of in line with the idea that there are specific areas of work and sort of specific approaches to doing it. To date, many of the relevant evaluations or proposals for evaluations that we've seen at the state and local level have focused on interventions such as implicit bias training that are designed to interrupt incidences of individual bias. And often they're focused on the point where community members might interact with government employees, such as the police or teachers. And I'm wondering if you think there are higher priority areas of research or other priority areas of research that can inform policies to foster racial equity on a sort of a broader institutional level. And this is sort of an open question for all of the panelists as well.
I have a quick thought about that. This isn't my area of research, but I know that increasingly jurisdictions and coalitions and nonprofit organizations are doing racial equity impact assessments as a way to, whatever the initiative or program is really thinking through how the current direction, what the consequences might be, how it may impact different racial and ethnic groups, and to be able to include that in planning, kind of mitigating any negative consequences and helping to push equitable strategies. And I don't know if there's a lot of evidence on, how well they're used in terms of fidelity to whatever tool that's being employed. And as well as kind of the effectiveness after, did the use of that racial equity impact tool actually lead to equitable outcomes, short-term, intermediate, or long-term? So that's what came to my mind with that question.
Something that we've been experiencing locally is related to hiring, and particularly at in the civil service and city level. And under Mayor Nutter, one of the things that he instituted was a differential points for young people or participants who were completing some of the workforce investment programs that the city was making. So things like Power Corps, like graduates got um, additional points in the process because they had already completed that. And that was one of their ways of acknowledging the alternative post-secondary pathways that were existing in the city. And I think that's something that went beyond the implicit bias training, or like the individual having greater self-awareness. It really tried to address the structural issues with the hiring and related to, testing and scoring. And another thing that we've seen, the city employs, different times, seasonal employees, full-time employees. And in order to give credit to that path, they also were addressing the test preparation. So I have seen some strategies at the city level related to hiring that has led to some diversified outcomes in terms of those seasonal employees typically were, overwhelmingly people of color, overwhelmingly working maybe 9 out of the 12 months of the year. So their earnings were less, and being able to use that as the prior work experience credit was a really helpful transition in terms of getting more people of color employed in the civil service realm.
I would add kind of narrowly here that I think I'm personally somewhat skeptical of the effectiveness of anti-bias training. I think there's not much evidence that that kind of training actually affects people's behavior. I think it to some degree makes people more aware of their own biases, but it's really unclear how that translates. In part reflecting the fact that these are, often deep-seated things that are hard to change. So I think, going beyond that, for example, collecting data on people's performance, collecting data and actually tying people's, evaluations, their performance metrics to some measure of racial equity, I think is a much more impactful approach above and beyond anti-bias training, because I don't think there's evidence that that alone is going to do much.
Got it. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on that. With the last half hour, we're actually going to switch over to the audience Q&A now. And we'll start with a question for Conrad from Vicky Ibarra. And the question is, did the research presented control for racial and ethnic makeup of the location of the firm? And I also want to add on to that, I know you've done some research on how, for example, policies in the criminal justice system vary across county based on the overall diversity of the county. And I'm wondering if you can share a little bit for both those studies, how you sort of accounted for location and variations. And
Sure. Yeah. So for the figures I showed, there's a ton of kind of details in the background that I didn't really have the time to go through. But yes, these are definitely trying to take into account differences in the location of firms. So for example, when I showed that figure relating firm size to racial composition, the figure I showed you there did not account for location in any way, but it turns out that you can compare firms in the same industry, in the same metropolitan area, and you find the same basic patterns. Like this is not a feature of the kind of geographic distribution of firms. For the affirmative action research, for those figures that I showed you, what's actually kind of going on in the background there is I'm comparing firms that become contractors for the first time to basically similar firms and comparing their trajectories. So when you see that kind of sudden increase in the Black share of employees at these firms when they first become subject to these regulations, the way we're calculating that is really comparing the evolution of those firms to comparable firms that do not become contractors and so are not subject to these regulations. So you can think of that as controlling for things like industry location, trying to identify similar firms. On the second point that Kalila mentioned here, she's referencing this research I've done looking at variation in criminal justice outcomes across jurisdictions. So most of my research focuses on labor markets, but I've also done some work on the criminal justice system. And in this paper, what we identified is that even within a state, there's a lot of variation from county to county, which typically defines court jurisdictions here. There's a lot of variation from county to county in how punitive they are for a given arrest charge. So, if you're basically if you're arrested in one county versus another in the same state, the range of outcomes is as wide as, being 4 times more likely to get a jail sentence in one county versus another within the same state. So very relatively lenient places and relatively punitive places actually are very differ dramatically in how they're treating the same offenses. So we identified this variation, and one thing we were interested in is, okay, what explains variation across jurisdictions? And there are a few candidates. So it turns out that crime rates actually did not really predict how punitive courts were. Another hypothesis, the hypothesis we were most interested in, was that perhaps the racial composition of these jurisdictions actually predict how punitive they are. And we were kind of motivated to ask this question by existing research studying other aspects of local kind of government service provision, public good provisions that suggest that places that are more racially diverse tend to, for example, have less generous social safety nets, invest less in public goods. And one explanation for that is when people is really kind of driven by voter behavior. So there's research that when people are kind of thinking about what level of social safety net they want, or how much spending they want on public schools, they're thinking about who's likely to kind of benefit from that spending. And there's research suggesting that when people are making those kind of calculations, they're thinking about, whether I perceive someone belonging to my own group as likely to benefit versus someone belonging to the out group as likely to benefit. In group and out group can be defined depending on context in a number of different ways. Race is a very salient definition of in group and out group. So there, you might expect that people, if they perceive that most beneficiaries of, a generous social safety net are going to belong to some other racial group, then they might be less keen on providing that generous social safety net. You might kind of interpret someone's financial struggles differently. If they belong to your own group, you might think, well, this is just a luck of the draw thing. It could happen to anyone. I have a cousin who's in the same situation, versus looking at some out group, you might think, this is some reflection of their character. So there's research suggesting that kind of thinking is at play. And so we're applying that same reasoning to the criminal justice system. And what we find is consistent with this. So actually the most punitive jurisdictions within states are the ones that are the most racially heterogeneous, the most racially mixed, whereas the jurisdictions that are very heavily, in our case, we're mostly focused on fraction Black of jurisdictions. So the jurisdictions that are almost entirely white, or in our case, and in some cases almost entirely Hispanic, and jurisdictions that have large Black majorities, those are the jurisdictions that actually tend to be the most lenient when assigning sentences for someone who's arrested, whereas it's in between that you actually see the most punitive court systems.
Thanks for answering both of those questions. I'm seeing that there are a lot of questions coming in sort of on how we can enable equitable evaluations. What are the resources and sort of capacities needed? And this question from Anusidu is, what learning needs to happen on our end before we engage the community as part of a community engagement in the course of an evaluation? I'm worried that we could cause more harm if we haven't done work on our end first. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
This is Kentayani. I think that is a really excellent point. I did put into the chat a couple of resources that can be helpful in thinking through engaging community, specifically in the research context. I did want to mention earlier when I brought up the example of the REC, that one of the key considerations that kind of drives that work and some other community engagement projects that we're working on is around compensation. Sometimes we compensate, but it's not equitable compensation. So if you are engaging community, but you're asking them to go beyond, completing the survey, you want their knowledge of their community, you want their perspective on the research questions, the instruments, you want them to participate as data collectors or helping to make meaning of the data once you have preliminary or final findings, then we need to be compensating them similarly as we would be thinking about a consultant or ourselves. So I think that is a big consideration and it impacts the budget. So I think, really making sure that you are thinking about all of those things, just going beyond, I'm gonna have dinner and we're gonna provide transportation, but thinking about that compensation that's commensurate with what they're doing, and also timeline that it does it's going to take more time to have those conversations, and it may be, the first few times the trust isn't there, or we talked about the language earlier. They may not be ready by meeting one to really dig into whatever the topic is, because there needs to be some translation work done. And I also think that we should be thinking about how do we have them to do capacity building for us. So I think timeline is a big consideration. But again, the two guides, especially the Why Am I So research guide, is a great guide, just even for your community stakeholders and staff to look at. It's very plain language. It's for kind of every audience, and it's a good place to start. And certainly having a partner, like an evaluation partner that has experience with community engagement, that it's something that will be very, very helpful in your planning.
I think Katani hit the nail on the head around compensation, which is often overlooked. I do think, in addition to that, spending some time on your own intention, motivations, and values. She gave us an example where at the point where rubber meets the road, right, is when sort of you assume your values are shared, or you assume that your values are understood, right? And I do think that even before you go to understanding a community or a community's assets, you really do have to assess, what is it that you're trying to accomplish, and for whom and why, right? Like, is this about notoriety? Are you taking on equity because it's the thing of the day, or are you really interested in transformation and you want to be different and seek different outcomes, or you want to be more of an ally or an asset? So I do think we can't make community responsible for the work that only you can do, right? And if you need some support, or you need greater understanding about where your growth areas are, then you should compensate them like you would any other expert that would come in and assess, if your HR policies weren't working well, or, board assessments, all of those things. And so I do think that spending some time getting really clear about your motivation, intention, and your organization's culture, so that you could communicate that very effectively in the partnership. And then I think the other piece that is really important is assessing, what does it mean to share power, right? And how is that going to be visible? And I can use an example that's not really research-driven example, but it's something that relates to organizational culture. On our board, we've typically had, adults, et cetera. And something that I've been working on as a leader in two places in my organization is to make space for opportunity youth, and like looking at our positions and saying, are we like recruiting from our programs, right? Because I think we should be, employing the product that we're helping to try to create. And the other space was in board leadership. And something that people wanted young people on the board. And I was very much trying to make sure that we didn't have tokenism, that we had like authentic engagement, that people saw them as peers, that they didn't have to relive their experience with us as an organization, or their experience to what got them to our programs. Like, they weren't there to be this all-knowing guide so that these adults could have, an experience with they don't represent all young people, they represent themselves, and they were here. And it took us a year to get prepared to invite young people to the board. And even till this day, I still have to say to those young people sometimes, you do not have to share your experience in that way unless you are, comfortable in doing that. Or you are here to evaluate this consultant in the same way that this other person is here. And so what do you see that's missing? What are the questions that we should be asking that we're not? And I would say now we have the temperament on the board to respect their contributions as board members and colleagues. But it took us a year of having very intentional conversations about what was the motivation, why did we want young people here, what were we willing to change, how were we willing to show up, who was willing to mentor, how were they going to make space for their voice. And so I do think that there is a lot of reflection or self-assessment, organizational assessment work that is important even before you begin any of the actual research work, so that you're really starting from a space that you can grow from.
Thank you. So sort of related to that idea of voice, this question from Mary Ellen Wiggins for all of the panelists is, how do you think about these equity questions and the gatekeeping that happens when researchers and decision makers reflect low diversity? And maybe another way to ask that is just sort of, how important is it to have a diverse evaluation team, and how might the fact that there are there are very few, I think, economists from some underrepresented minorities right now, and how can we work to change that, and how do we think that'll improve evaluation in the future?
So, I mean, I can speak to that a little bit. I mean, I think, yeah, this is certainly in the economics profession. This is certainly a big problem that you know, a ton of people are making a lot of effort to improve, but I think it's been a problem for a while, and people have tried in the past. So we'll see what actually happens. I guess, yeah, I don't have a particularly like helpful response to that. I think it is incredibly important. I think it's definitely the case that in research, in economics research, social science more generally, like, we come to this work with our own experiences, with our own beliefs, and it certainly affects the kinds of questions we ask, which communities we're willing to engage with seriously. So, I mean, I think from the perspective of someone who's considering, you know, doing some kind of research, or engaging with some research, or doing some kind of evaluation, I mean, I think that's definitely something you want to keep in mind. Like, am I working with someone who sort of understands this area? And that's not necessarily directly tied to you know, the person's race per se. Like, someone can seriously engage with these issues from any background. But I think it is an important thing to keep in mind. Have they worked on this in this area in a serious way? Do they seem like someone that's kind of engaged, you know, the relevant communities in a serious way?
And just to build on what Conrad was saying, I think also, you know, if you're in that situation where you can't change the diversity, you know, the composition of that research team, or the program team, you know, it's really important for people to examine their own background and biases. And to Conrad's point, it could be that there's something in their background that helps them to connect with that community. On the same token, it could be a bias or something else in the background that is a barrier. And so I think going through a process of examining what that is, being reflective and reflexive at the beginning of the project and throughout is something that can be very helpful. And so if you're working with partners, or you're on the cusp of selecting an evaluation or research partner, to, you know, talk about that. You know, we all have, you know, different backgrounds and biases. Obviously there's different composition in the community than on this team. You know, how can we begin to have a conversation about how we show up in the work and in the room? And I think that's helpful, and certainly also to be prepared to have those hard, critical conversations when something does come up, that there's some cultural dissonance or what have you, to be able to, you know, calmly have a conversation about it and kind of work through a solution. And I also wanted to lift up, where we started, around personal networks, and often it is our personal networks and, who we know that limits our ability to find more diversity and create diverse teams or identify a firm of color. And so it can be really important to, to also recognize that and to look for ways to expand your network, because it could be that there's a partner that exists, but you don't know about them. So, how can you expand your own personal network? Casey's part of our equity journey and research evaluation and data, we incubated Expanding the Bench in 2014 to 2017. It's an initiative to increase the number of evaluators of color that engage with philanthropy. So there's one pipeline program that takes researchers that have an interest in evaluation and provide it and culture responsive, equitable evaluation, and provide them with a year-long experience where they gain capacities, experience, and relationships to make that transition to evaluation. And another component of that is the advancing, so I'm going to say it wrong because the name changed, advancing culturally responsive and equitable evaluation network of seasoned evaluators of color. And if you're interested, if you're saying, oh, I'd love to expand my network of evaluators of color, you can go to expandingthebench.org. It's managed by an organization called Change Matrix, and you can find out more about that network of evaluators of color, many of whom are researchers with academic backgrounds. So there's, if you're more interested in a policy researcher, you still may find that resource in the ACE in that database. But again, Expanding the Bench was really found on the notion that yes, there's been barriers to access for specific underrepresented groups because of past social injustices. At the same time, there's an excellence imperative, because we really believe that when you have diverse teams, you're really improving the likelihood that your methods, interpretation, analyses are going to be stronger. So it's on that strength, and I think that was the spirit of the question, that we really believe that it's important to pursue. Even though your reality may be something different, but to really always have on your radar to pursue finding diverse evaluation and research partners.
Thanks for that. We have time for one more question, so maybe we can go around and have all the panelists answer it in alphabetical order, maybe starting with Shakima. And it's just, what is your highest priority research question that, if answered, could provide some crucial evidence to inform equitable policies? And what conditions or resources do you think are necessary in order to implement a strong randomized evaluation to help answer it?
That's a loaded question, so I'm going to try to limit myself to maybe what's top of mind for me right now. In our work, one of the greatest challenges we have is the shift and just the conception and delivery of how traditional work happens, right? And so we have both the emerging workers or the next generation of workers, which right now we're focused on Gen Z, and the Alpha generation, and thinking about how our experiences need to expand in order to prepare them for a variety of careers, both job seekers or job creators. And so I think for me, our biggest question is about learning and uptake, right? What's been effective currently, and what do we know about the way the future of work is shaping up? What do we need to change? And that's not like a very specific question, but that is the thing that I'm grappling with. And I think when you take it from an equity standpoint, for me, it's who's participating and who's left out. it comes down to who am I consistently turning away from our services, because we have at least 50% more people asking for the work-based learning experiences than we can provide. And what can I do to change that? Whether that's, different resources, different monies, different experiences. But that's the question for me, is who am I turning away, and what's the impact of that, and what can we do differently in order to make the services more accessible to those in need.
For me, I think, my presentation to a large degree kind of reflects the questions I'm most interested in and how I might go about answering them. I think just to summarize again, I guess a question that has interested me for a long time is, why do firms vary so much in the hiring decisions they make, and what implications does it have for racial inequality in the labor market more generally? And I think my research has pointed me to kind of think about how firms vary and how good they are at basically screening workers from different groups, like how connected they are to different employment agencies, different schools they might recruit from. I think there's a host of possibilities in terms of how these firms differ in their screening and recruiting practices, and I think it's a tough problem to really tackle, because the data aren't great. There's not a lot of great kind of nationally representative data sets that tie firms' hiring practices to their outcomes. So for me, collecting that data and then actually devising randomized evaluations where you check and see, okay, which of these approaches actually leads to what outcome in a rigorous way, I think is a challenging thing to do, because hiring decisions are so important. It's a hard thing to kind of think about actually randomizing at some level. But I think it's incredibly important for really understanding these dramatic differences we see across firms that generate significant workplace segregation. Along race, but also along a number of dimensions, and not just in the U.S. and a variety of countries. So I think there's a ton of interesting studies to do in that space.
I don't know if I would raise a specific question. I think that it's just really important in all the work that we do to really go beyond kind of the surface, go beyond identifying the disparities, and really have as part of our research questions, understanding systemic drivers, understanding the role of structural racism, institutional racism, context, culture, and history, as I raised earlier. I think there's room broadly across research, especially on children, youth, and families of color in disadvantaged communities in particular, where we're focused on health, well-being, education, employment, et cetera, to really be pointed in that direction, because a lot of the solutions are really in that area, as opposed to the kind of the individual level factors that we tend to focus on and pathologize.
Great. Thank you all for answering that. So I think we're about to wrap up, but a huge, huge thank you to each of our panelists for joining today, and to everyone who was also able to attend. I'm going to pass the mic now to Jess on our state and local team to share some upcoming opportunities.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to quickly share my screen to provide some contact information for everyone. So for Kalila, who's leading our racial equity work, and then for myself and Rohit, who are work on the state and local team, please reach out if you have any questions or comments, or you're interested in working with us in any way. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much to our panelists. Thanks so much for our attendees for attending our third webinar in the virtual series. I also just want to remind everyone that our next and final webinar in the series will take place on November 20th from 2:15 to 3:45 p.m. It'll be kind of in the similar vein of this discussion, a discussion on increasing the take-up of COVID-19 testing and other healthcare services, particularly for Black and Brown communities. And I think we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the history of a lot of the anti-Black racism that has happened in randomized evaluations, particularly in health, and discuss some of the key lessons from recent evaluations for states to respond to the ongoing public health crisis. If you're not registered for that event, I'll send the link in the chat. And then one final plug, if you have been to the last two webinars, you've heard this, but we have some funding opportunities for state and local governments and researchers who work with state and local governments opening in spring 2021. We are particularly interested in receiving proposals to work with states to develop evaluations around racial equity issues. So please get in touch with us if you have questions about that. We will be announcing the exact dates soon. So make sure you're subscribed to JPAL's newsletter and our state and local innovation initiative mailing list to receive the updates. Yeah, thanks again for attending today. And we hope to see you in a few weeks for our next webinar. One note, when you do end the Zoom meeting, I think a pop-up box will pop up with a survey. We'd love to hear your feedback. We've really enjoyed putting these webinars together, and we'd love to hear what you liked about them or what you disliked about them, so we can keep doing them. Great, have a great day. Bye.